This is Colin Ahern and Lessons from the Front Lines.
Great. Thank you. Firstly, thanks everybody for spending the last talk with us. It's really, really appreciate it. I'm going to try very hard to make it a little shorter than advertised so we can all get to the important stuff like the pool party. Firstly, standard disclaimer, I do work for a government, so these are my views, not the views of the government I represent. These aren't official policies. These aren't official positions. These are my thoughts and my thoughts alone, so please take them with that in mind. Here's the agenda for today. We will have time for questions at the end, as she mentioned. Firstly, who am I, and what is New York City Cyber Command, and what makes that organization special? Then I'm going to talk about some potentially useful frameworks that we use to help us frame this really, really, really gigantic problem. Some of our thoughts on security governance and incident response and why those fields are really closely related, and what we're doing with data science and research and why a lot of problems are actually data problems in disguise, and how we, as the organization that is charged with defending the government of the City of New York's networks, thinks about future architecture choices that ensure reliability and security. Because ultimately, what we're aiming to do is provide reliable services to residents, visitors, and businesses. That's the name of this game. So joining us on this journey, really, really appreciate the folks at BSides for letting us talk about it. Firstly, how many people live in a city, any major metro area at all? And how many people live in New York City? A few. Great. So I think it goes without saying that, firstly, New York City is the best city, and secondly, that cities are becoming increasingly interconnected. Things that we're doing as municipal governments and businesses were unimaginable 5 or even 3 years ago in some cases. So throughout this talk, I'd like you guys to think about, if you've never considered public service, consider serving in the public, consider a job at New York City Cyber Command, or if you live in another city, your municipality. There is no secret team that is going to solve these problems. The keynote that Josh gave, he really couldn't have said it any better. The people in this room, the people at this con, we are going to solve these problems together, or they're not going to get solved. So really, as we talk about this, we want to share with you the way we think about this problem, why we're doing interesting things, and why we think that you can contribute, either signing up for one of the jobs we have posted, or continuing to be involved in your community in a positive and constructive way. But as for me, I live in Brooklyn with my wife. I like long walks on the beach, applied crypto, public service, and tensoring flows. I have degrees from Tulane and NYU. And I spent a number of years in military intelligence in the U.S. Army. I deployed twice to Afghanistan, and I commanded a company at U.S. Army Cyber Command. After I left government service, I worked in security engineering and cyber threat research at a major financial institution. And I think, like everybody, the main takeaway from this slide is that my GitHub does need updating. So if you see it, bear that in mind. So history of cybersecurity and history of computing in the largest major metro area in North America. New York City actually has a long and storied history of using computing to deliver city services. In fact, there's a member of our staff that has been on the mainframe team for 45 years. So when I say that New York City has a long history of computing excellence, I mean a long history of computing excellence. And in fact, not the same actual mainframes, but those same mainframe applications and their descendants continue to provide services. There was a great talk earlier about mainframes on the internet. So these are very real, interesting technical challenges associated with mainframes. And I can geek out about mainframes for a long time, but I won't. What I will say is that longevity and that history is an advantage. Well, we see that as an asset. We also build on a long history of security at the city's Department of Information Technology and Telecommunications, which was formed in 1994. And the Department of Info Tech and Telecom is known as DOIT, D-O-I-T-T, is led by the city's Chief Information Officer and is the city's technology core. It's also the city's internet service provider. They have hundreds of miles of dark fiber cable connecting city agencies, hundreds of points of presence, and it's a high-speed dark fiber network, outbound internet connection. And one thing that the Department of IT does that you, I hope, have heard of is New York City Open Data. That was in 2012, a local law made available huge amounts of publicly generated data for anyone, anywhere. And that really started the municipal open data movement in a real and important way. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about with research and other things, we see that as our contribution, as our role as the city's cybersecurity organization, but really part and parcel with supporting open data. And that includes going to awesome talks at BSides. And that data, by the way, is hosted by city-owned systems. If you ask for New York City open data, you are getting data from a server, probably not a mainframe, but definitely a server owned by the city of New York. And that's inspired some things as countless student projects doing city bike data, really and behind the scenes of open data is the huge effort to make that data ready. As all good data engineers know, 90% of the boring part is getting the data ready, and 10% of the fun part is running the model. So this is just part of the city's history and its legacy. So New York City Cyber Command, as I said, descended from DO-IT, formed by executive order of Mayor Bill de Blasio on 11 July 2017. And it's cyber defense and incident response for New York City government. And New York City government, just at a high level, is 143 separate organizations. Everything from 10-person policy organizations doing cutting-edge policy research and immigrant affairs and women's health and other things, to 50,000 New York City police officers, 30,000 New York City Fire Department. And all told, it's about 300,000 employees. And if the 300,000 employees of the city government were their own country, they would be as populous as Iceland. And if the city budget, which is about $85 billion, were a country itself, it would approximate the GDP of Lithuania. So when we talk about large, complex organizations, we are talking complexity at a scale that is really more akin to a nation state than a local government. And the network itself, as I mentioned, is also quite large. There are 3/16 Class B public IP addresses. That's almost 200,000. And that connects over 400,000 devices, from traffic lights to mainframes to servers serving microserviced applications on the internet today. So a wide breadth of technology excellence. So the real meat of this executive order, and it's riveting stuff, I encourage you all to read it, is that we do 5 primary things. 1, we ensure compliance with information security policies and standards. 2, we mitigate cyber threats. 3, we mandate deployment of technology and administrative controls on city-owned systems. 4, we review cyber spending for efficiency and effectiveness. 5, we collaborate with governments and outside entities, like giving talks at BSides. And additionally, we provide guidance on cyber defense and information risk to the mayor and city agencies. And there have been some great talks about policies, and one of the things I want to spend a couple minutes doing is why this is special for a .gov of such enormous scale. And I kind of sketched out the enormous scale of the city government, and budget authority is really important. And what I think I want you to take away from the budget authority piece is, for a government to give a cyber defense organization budgetary approval is akin to if the director of national intelligence could tell other intelligence community partners what they could and could not spend their money on. And that's a major criticism of the way the intelligence community reorganized after 9/11, and was a recommendation of the President's Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity, which was released by President Obama in December before he left office. So, we, the city of New York, took those recommendations very seriously and integrated them into this framework. And 2, centralized ability to deploy tech. How can you defend a whole city if you can't see the whole city? And given the large complexity and federation of this environment, kind of contrast that with the federal government, whereby the federal CISO at the moment sits in OMB, but there's a DHS relationship and the NKIC, and there's a lot going on, right? So this move to centralization and unification is also right out of the Commission on Enhancing National Cybersecurity. And a cloud-first strategy. So we have a number of initiatives cloud-first. We're working with a major cloud provider on a data science and incident response environment, of which I will illuminate a little more later. And really this is about being agile, being flexible, and being responsible. Being responsible with the resources that the taxpayers have been generous enough to give us to solve this problem, and us being agile enough, and agile enough for any organization, not just a government, to apply cutting-edge tools, tactics, techniques, and procedures in an environment of high reliability and high security. And so how is New York City Cyber Command organized? At a high level, we have small unified teams with a clear mission. We have 3 primary lines of effort. One is a threat management organization. That's where the incident response happens. There's a security operations center, which operates 24/7. It has forensic analysts. There's a CERT, SOC analysts, threat intelligence, threat hunters, hackers, ne'er-do-wells, all manner of people working hard every day to combat cyber threats on behalf of the city. 2, we have a security architecture and engineering team. That's where our data science team and our lead data scientists work. And that data science team directly informs the threat responders in that tower and the executives in the governance tower. There's nothing worse than having a data science team where the insights they generate don't end up eating anything. So our commitment to our data science team is you produce insight, we make decisions. And that's something that if you're looking to build a data science team in your own organization, we think that's a necessary predicate to that being successful. We also have security engineers, including identity engineers, firewall engineers, and security architects. Lastly, and maybe most importantly at some level, is governance. We have a policy organization, application security folks, governance specialists, grant writers, auditors, all the things that really turn theory into practice, and that's incredibly important. And one thing we want to highlight on this slide that we think is unique is we manage talent via an alumni model. So New York City Cyber Command isn't the place you have to enter when you're 22 and leave when you're 60. Although Frank from the mainframe team is doing great and wonderful things every day, not everybody can be Frank. And we recognize and understand that. And so our commitment to our staff is that if you're here for 2 years or 20 years or 45 years, you can contribute that entire time. And that takes dedication from the leadership team. That doesn't just happen. And so that's an important part of us and how we think we can interact with the outside community. And if you are considering a career in public service, why an organization that thinks like this and talks like this might be more appealing than an organization where everything is highly dependent on tribal knowledge, things are not very process-oriented. These are things that we are actively trying to evolve in our own organization because we are very committed to working with outside partners. Be they people who work for our organization or people who work with us. So kind of with that background out of the way, I want to spend a few minutes on operational approach and operational design. And though this is a hacking conference, the difference between a great idea and a successful project is operational design. And the operational design that we use is called Hayden's Principle, named after General Mike Hayden, who is the director of the CIA and the director of the NSA as well. And the purpose of this operational design is to minimize the impact of magical thinking. And hat tip to Mara and her phenomenal talk early this afternoon for those of you that caught it. And the first thing to avoid magical thinking is operational relevance. Do the bad guys who care about me care about this? That is the first question we ask ourselves when we undergo major transformative efforts like New York City Cyber Command, like major technology roadmap journeys. And threat modeling. There's been a lot of great talks here about threat modeling. There's a lot of great ways to do threat modeling, but having a codified practice surrounding threat modeling, making your assumptions explicit, obviously all models are bad, some models are useful. And having a useful model that people can measure themselves against makes your threat models more reproducible, more data-driven, more quantifiable. And when we talk about data as a problem, these need to be inputs to some model someplace ultimately. And when we talk about operational relevance, it's not just the good guys that are doing behavioral things and doing machine learning things. The velocity and variety and sophistication of attacks has really increased, and so operational relevance really needs to be taken at machine speed. Technically feasible. Can we actually do this today? And if we can't, what are the things we need to have tomorrow in terms of resources, people, time, and money? And what that delta, and how do we bridge that gap? And there was a great talk earlier by policy and procurement and how relevant that is. We work very, very hard, as I said, to safeguard the resources of our taxpayers, and that includes thinking a lot about the relationship between technical feasibility and our ability to procure things. So, if for those of you in government are considering it, that is a very real concern. And political sustainability. And the reason we put this one at the bottom is because for practitioners of some persuasion, this is both the most boring and the most important part of operational decision making. And political sustainability, I don't mean politics with a capital P like elections, November. I mean politics with a small p, like fitting the culture of your organization and meshing that with your operational design. And seeing executives as key stakeholders in your operational design. Executives aren't people for you to manage. Executives are team members who have a valuable input to how you do operations. And seeing them, because this is the thing they do. If it's not clear to you what your executive team does, what they do is have an extremely keen understanding of what is politically sustainable. And if you don't include them in designing your strategies, it's unlikely that you'll get their buy-in or that this will succeed. And moving from a hero model to a team of teams approach. And last and certainly not least, legal. The legal landscape in cyber evolves every day. And lawyers are force multipliers. That, what is legal today might not be legal tomorrow. Legal risk is a thing to be managed by professionals. So I thought I read it on Wikipedia, not a sufficient answer. I checked with the general counsel, sufficient answer. So governance, want to spend a couple minutes on governance. And, New York City, greatest city in the world, that's looking south, Freedom Tower in the background. Like I said, we have agencies that range from 7 to 50,000 people. And managing and unifying those efforts is incredibly challenging. But the upshot is that if you work on governance in an organization like this, even for a little bit, you can change the way people talk about this in the city government for years to come. The words people use, the way they think about problems, the tools they think they have at their disposal. And as a technical professional, that's incredibly powerful. You can change what people think is probable to occur. And when we think about problems, looking out over this great vista, connected devices in smart cities. How do we think about governance and its relationship to technical feasibility when your watch can report a crime to the police? And what is the difference between data integrity and disinformation? And how do we address that technically and from a policy perspective? Firstly, this quote, this is what governance is. If I could give you what is governance? Governance is, in theory, there is no difference between theory and practice. In practice, there is. This quote is often misattributed to Einstein, but actually was said by this guy. Yogi Berra. Yogi Berra. It's New York City, gotta have a Yankee. And governance is making the theory and the practice as close together as possible. An incident response. One of the things we think is unique is guilty until proven innocent. And that's supposed to be the back of a monitor, and that's a layer 2 network contained for those of you that don't get my amazing clip art skills. And how do we contain a threat while balancing accessibility and reliable access of those services to residents? If you think you can figure that out as the attack is unfolding, you are probably wrong. If you don't have a governance structure that addresses how these decisions are made, that has executive support, that is legal, it is unlikely that this is going to work. And what you're going to end up doing is being frustrated getting pwned and being sad. So why we put this after all the governance stuff is though this is the cool part, this is the pointy end of the spear. And like I said, you can see our organization, we spend a lot of effort on this. But we spend a lot of effort on the governance part because they enable these people to do their work. They enable them to make decisions within a framework that is mutually intelligible and collectively exhaustive insofar as the inputs that are needed for the decision maker of an appropriate level to make. It's one thing to say, I'm going to network contain some endpoint that just got phished. And it's another to say that I'm going to turn off the server serving nyc.gov. So if you don't have a framework for deciding how both of those decisions are made, it's important. And who thinks that all of incident response can be automated? Maybe? So incident response is making decisions. And to make decisions, we need data. And the question we ask ourselves is, can a robot do this? And we talk about cybersecurity as a data problem. Decisions need insight. Insight needs information, and information needs data. So things really, when we get to incident response, and I talked about their relationship to the data science team, an extract, normalize, transform data ingestion pipeline isn't just like a cool thing. It's incredibly relevant for the incident responders. And how do we decide what we are automating and why? I'd like to spend just a couple of minutes on a framework we use to help us allocate our scarce resources of automation. Obviously, we have an incredibly diverse organization. Not everybody can do automation. And maybe a lot of people in this audience can, swag a Perl script, write a bash script to, repeatedly do some repetitive task. But in large organizations, that's ultimately a finite resource. And it's not about making one person's life easier. It's about advancing this mission. And so how do we think about that? This is a framework, and for those of you, many of you have probably seen it. It's called Coonofin, although I'm sure I mispronounced that. It was developed by Harvard researchers in the late 90s to optimize decision making. And how we use it is that most of our problems are multimodal. They're made up of more than one of these four things. So different parts of our problem should be either automated entirely or orchestrated in order to enable our human responders to maximally apply their effort and talent. And this is obviously related to the OODA loop, observe, orient, decide, act, which is made famous by the Marine Corps. And you can see a lot of the similar words, and I'll go through it. And not everything can be automated yet, although I do think it's useful to look at this. This is a framework, and obviously it has its shortcomings. To look at this within the context of what your data science team can provide for you and what their relationship is in each one of these areas. Because obviously, different parts of different components can be automated in different ways. But very briefly, the first one is best practice. I can get my pointer to work. Yeah, over there in the bottom right. And this is the area of known knowns. This is a stable situation where cause and effect can be observed from the outside. And the way we respond to this is we establish the facts by sensing them, categorize them, and then apply the best practice. Should I accept an email? Are they in spam house? No. Best practice. Should I allow connection to this IP? Is it a known malicious IP? No. Okay, don't. This is also standard operating procedures, things like never draw to an inside straight. Always bet on the pass line at the crafts table. Find the proper rule and apply it. Help desk tasks, scripts. When you do a task more than twice, you write a script for it. That's this. Evolving this, we have the area of good practice here. This is also called the complicated domain, and this is known unknowns. And sense, analyze, respond, what we mean by that is there's a range of right answers, but they depend on some context outside of the facts that are immediately visible. So we assess the facts, we analyze them to establish their context to me, and then apply a good operating practice. And an example of this is intelligence analysis, the legal profession, software engineering in certain contexts. And artificial intelligence does well here. Narrow AI, weak AI. Big blue, obviously, or deep blue, doing things in chess and AlphaGo. Over the last year, we see artificial intelligence and data attacking problems and automation doing things that were not previously thought possible. But it's reducing those problems to this domain in one view. And thirdly, emergent practice, or the complex domain, is unknown unknowns. And cause and effect can only be deduced in retrospect. When you're in the middle of unfolding an incident or you're analyzing a new piece of malware, eventually you will determine cause and effect. But as this process is unfolding, it is not apparent to you. And this is where we need to allow experimentation. And in this construct, experimentation is called probe, sense, respond. But this is where we as leaders in organizations need to allow people to spend time experimenting and screwing around. Why do we want to allow them to do this? Why should we allocate scarce resources on experimentation? Because if we can move emergent practice to good practice and eventually to best practice, well, then I definitely can automate it. And so that's a way to communicate to executives and say, I have these guys just sitting here doing nothing. No, sir, they're not doing nothing. They are experimenting in order to increase the efficiency of this entire effort. And finally, there's novel practice. This is also called the chaotic domain. And this is where cause and effect are unclear even in retrospect. So you find things like a battlefield, a disaster, the middle of a complex incident where you're not even sure if you can reproduce the issue or where it started. And this is where you need to act in order to establish order in this chaos and then move out of this domain. So acting, sensing, and responding means if the whole world is being turned upside down, the most rational thing to do is start acting to immediately apply order to the situation. And again, this is just a framework, but we use this in our operational design for incident response because it allows us to contextualize what we're doing with Python. At some level, all automation is some Python script via some API. But if we can take it up one level, we can really evolve the way we think about it as an organization. And data science and research moving along. We talked about threat modeling. New York City Cyber Command is collaborating with the University of Maryland. We have a paper in draft doing enterprise-level threat modeling. And really, that's our commitment to open data. We're happy to partner. It's actually Rock Stevens, who has come to BSides for many years, if you know Rock. He's working with us in this effort. And hopefully next year, Rock and I can come back and talk about the paper in some more detail. But threat modeling is also not a thing that happens in a vacuum or should be done in secret. So it's important that as a community we share the right things. When we talk about information sharing and data and research and open data and this, obviously we're committed to sharing ephemeral indicators of attack and compromise like everybody else. But why we wanted to go on this research journey with the University of Maryland is that we want to share things that are hard for the attacker to reproduce. A DNS or an IP is easy for name your attacker to get and throw away. But their modus operandi that we can deduce through advanced threat modeling is hard for them to discard. So that's part of the reason we're on that journey. And working with a major cloud provider on a data environment, and obviously that's a thing that is important to all of the things we discussed. So future architecture. Visibility without, quote, actionability. And I'm not sure that actionability is a word. We had some debate about whether that's a real word or not, but it's a word that we use. We can make up words. We're New York City Cyber Command. Having something I see but can't do anything about is not useful to me. So when we talk about future architectures, it's not that we want visibility. We want to see things and then stop those things if it is appropriate to do so. So no orphan alerts, nothing that is on span that could be in line. And again, when we talk about all the things leading up to this, why is it that some organizations have problems putting their email appliance into block instead of transparent BCC? It's because of at some level a lack of communication about why that's important and not integrating your decision maker into this process from the beginning. And the success that we've had is, do you want me to tell you something bad has happened, or do you want me to tell you I stopped something bad? And obviously, the latter. And the maintenance of logs for retrospective analysis, obviously, breaches get harder and harder to detect. So when we think about architecture choices and visibility, we think about maintaining logs and telemetry and net flows and other things like that for retrospective analysis, not only for our big data, but also, again, when we think about automation and orchestration, so we can experiment, so we can learn new things. And perimeter-focused cybersecurity. So in the bottom right, that is the pinnacle of military engineering of the middle of the 20th century. That is an actual fort that was on the Maginot Line, and the Maginot Line was a series of fortifications built by the French government, the French military, after World War I. They took the absolute greatest minds in France, and they said, how do we defend against an invasion that we know is coming? We know it. And they said, we'll build a bunch of forts. But, obviously, what did the Germans do? They went through Belgium, and the forts were irrelevant. So when we think about the future of architecture, we think of zero trust networks. And we are actively building zero trust networks for our responders because we have the same concerns that these other organizations that have given talks over the last few B-sides. We want reliability and we want security. And not only that, we can't be dependent on these models that have been proven to be inadequate over many, many years. So network segmentation, firewalls are incredibly important, and we seek to do them very well, but we also seek to evolve our architecture and be thought leaders within a municipal, but within a .gov by adopting zero trust network architectures. And my view on zero trust networking is that it is really approaching this from an information dominance perspective. There's a saying from where I used to work that the moment you know more about their network than they do, it's not their network anymore. It's your network. So on some level, this is an information game. This is a game about data. So what zero trust networking makes possible, or even sometimes probable, is that you might at any one moment know more about your network than the adversary because only you know the sum total of your devices and your identities. You only know the union of those two things. Whereas if you have a traditional network architecture, if in any one network segment an adversary can achieve information dominance over you, how do you know that what they're doing is bad? You don't. And that's why the capture the flag, we can see this attack and defend scenario play out again and again and again. And at some level, a way to think of it is an information dominance game. And when we communicate to our executives, when we say, why is this crazy thing important? We say, well, this is an approach that it's not a perfect approach. No approach is perfect. But it is an approach that approaches, probabilistically a model that might work. And if you're not sure what kind of problem you have, it's probably a data problem. And my final slide, public service is really, really important. Like I said, there's no secret team that is going to figure this out. There's no magic answer. The secret is there is no secret. This is hard work, and we have no glory here, only the honor of doing a hard job well. And nyc.gov/jobs, we are hiring CERT team, data wranglers, sec engineers, threat hunters, policy wonks. I encourage you to think of public service not as a boring thing that people you don't really like do, but as a thing that you could do to advance your career, broaden your horizons, and do some cool stuff. So take some time to not only think about this organization that I work for and that I'm passionate about, but however you can contribute to solving this problem. And that to me is what B-Sides is about, and why the first time we talk about this, New York City Cyber Command, is at B-Sides. We chose to do that because we believe in that kind of community involvement. So that is, again, thank you guys so much. I'm going to do the best I can to answer questions in the 9 or so minutes that remain. And again, my thoughts and my thoughts alone. And with me is my partner in crime, Andrew. So if you guys have some questions, happy to try to field them. Thanks again.
Anybody?
I was wondering about earlier in the slides, I think you said something like you basically enforce policy. And I was wondering what kind of relationship you have to the creation of the policy and who creates it.
Yeah, great question. So New York City Cyber Command creates the policy. And we enforce, we ensure, I would say we ensure the policy. And we ensure it via administrative and technical control, if that makes sense. Yeah, so it's not some other person who's never met an incident responder policy. Yeah, so that's a good question.
So to reference back your automation versus orchestration, have you guys utilized any of the neurological networking to advance some of your threat modeling, if you will? Or
The what networking?
Neurological networking.
Yeah. So, yeah, we're using a variety of models. What I would say is our data scientist, he and his team seek to use the model that is the most efficient. Not necessarily the coolest model, although recursive and convolutional neural networks are a part of the data science that we do, not only because they're sweet and they're fun to say, but also because for some things they are more efficient. And they do generate a higher ROC curve. Yeah, so short answer, yes. Long answer, not a priori because they're deep neural networks, but more because they're the most appropriate model for that problem. And one of the things that he's really excited to explore is what is the relationship between those models and, obviously generative adversarial networks that have been talked about before, using these models together and providing the system, the model generation itself, reasons to think of things that you couldn't have thought of because you're not a computer. So, yeah, so just trying to fit the model to the problem, not the other way around.
So I had a question on your data science practice. I mean, looks like you're really building your data science capabilities, but I didn't see any when you showed the slide on open positions. Looks like you're not hiring for data science. It's more for data wrangling and other kind of stuff.
Yeah, so we are building out the team. We will be posting more positions. To digress very briefly into boring city stuff, the city does its hiring processes 4 times a year. So if you don't see them now, you will see them later. And if you connect with me after, we're always looking to have resumes and have relationships with people that want jobs that when they open up, we can make sure that we connect. So
Thank
good
you.
question.
Obviously, a very large and very diverse organization. You'd mentioned the importance of visibility, having the information you need so you can act. What are your biggest challenges in achieving the desired visibility that your team requires? And can you share a little bit of how you've achieved some of those goals and what's been the most operationally effective ways that you've met your visibility goals?
Great question. So the way we think about it is we have really one problem with 2 parts. We have a visibility and actionability problem. So the way we've done it is addressing it at the endpoint and the network edge. One of the advantages that New York City has, unlike other 300,000 person organizations that have $85 billion, everybody's within the 5 boroughs. So our network edge is actually, relatively speaking, though large, is finite. So we can get visibility there and actionability there. Obviously, I said the city has an ISP, so you can think of it that only serves city entities. And additionally, we can mandate a technical control like an endpoint agent. So the ways that we address that is those 2 ways, working in concert with the city's network and mandating an endpoint agent. So good question.
Anybody else?
Great. Well, thanks everybody. Much appreciated.